The live-action How to Train Your Dragon remake means John Powell has to remake his most popular score, that gets praised above all others and that got him a well-deserved Oscar nomination. But how much will be the same, and how much has to change for the new movie to work? Here's new insight from Powell, plus an educated guess for the themes, orchestration, songs, and the tone, all of which center around the difference between animation and live action, which Powell has had to find.
It's either going to be the easiest job I've ever had, or the hardest.
The biggest question is, will the themes return? On the movie podcast, which was recorded well before he could know anything, John Powell said,
If a bunch of the old score is useful, then great. If it's not, we'll figure out how to do it.
If that sounds like he might be throwing some out, don't worry. Recently, upon receiving his second Oscar nomination for Wicked, he told Collider, "A lot of the music is the same, but it has to work in a slightly different way sometimes. Some very different ways sometimes. So we know it's there in some capacity. But this is a remake of the first film, so will the sequel themes return? My best guess is each theme represents an idea in the story, so themes will likely return if the ideas do." Powell added he's excited for the expanded version of the story, which means there could be new themes too. But more on the themes at the end of the video. Side note, I know they say it's not a shot-for-shot remake, that they're doing their own version, making changes, but from 99% of what we've seen so far, yes, this is still a remake. Bear in mind, John Powell probably has no idea if there will be a sequel to Foreshadow.
We'll have to wait and see it.
And the trilogy has dozens of themes and motifs. The more he uses, the more crowded and messy the score will be. His job is to score this movie, not to bring everything back. For Orchestration, his composition skills have changed, and he'll likely take with him everything he's learned. Recently, he's moved away from exaggerated brass sections with 12 horns, learning to do more with less, which I made a video on. The closest thing to Powell's bizarre situation is probably The Lion King, in which Hans Zimmer scored the original and then returned to do the same score again for the live action. Zimmer made the same cues again, but with expanded orchestration. But How to Train Your Dragon already has a bigger sound than the original Lion King, and I disagree with the idea that the live action needs to sound or feel bigger than the original. The biggest change in the trilogy is probably the choir, which began as mostly oohs and ahs. Then after scoring a full choir album, Powell's choral writing improved. The trailer contains vocalizations from the Vikings, but that's mostly just grunts again. So maybe there will be a diegetic element to the choir. Speaking of singing, there will probably be another Yonsei song or collaboration. I know why they're here, but I don't love them. I've covered that in videos too. I find them to be out of place in this Viking world, but I'm far less invested in this movie than the original trilogy anyway, so I don't really care. Dean DeBlois has suggested he wants a darker, more mature version of this story, without the limits of a PG rating. Again, I disagree that it would be better, but is this one darker? It's hard to say. But John Powell has a method for gauging tone to communicate from directors how they want the story to sound. He calls it the Stalling scale, named for Looney Tunes composer Carl Stalling, which you might know if you've seen my last video.
In animation, I call the stalling number, so all of that Bugs Bunny stuff that's incredibly tight to picture.
Can you believe this came up 2 videos in a row? That shows what an influence Stalling was.
Like this?
But How to Train Your Dragon was always on the dramatic end of the scale, never cartoony, meaning Powell never treated the original as a cartoon. So I don't know how much darker or more real this would sound. So what is the difference between live action and animation? Powell says live action is a play, that he's having to figure it all out now because some things can work the same in a similar scene, but something has to change for it to connect in a slightly different way because it's live action. That he's having to do all these really subtle things, and some not subtle things. It's weird to be doing it again, but it's good to revisit. Like I said earlier, John Powell wrote dozens of themes and motifs for the trilogy, which can be hard to keep track of. So I'm making a trilogy of videos to name and explain each. Like this video to see those, and leave a comment on what you'd like to hear from the new soundtrack. Thanks for watching.